Co-coordinator for the year of Peru, and really delighted to introduce our speaker today, who I think was first recommended by Dr. Robert Simon, who was a student at one time of our speaker today. So it's nice to have some extra kind of personal connection with the speaker on our campus. Dr. Lasarte is from Peru, and he did his first degree at the National Engineering University in Lima. And then he started studying literature. He did a Master's of Arts in Latin American Studies from the University of Texas, and a PhD in Romance Languages and Literatures from the University of Michigan. He's currently in the program, directing the program in Latin American Studies?
No, I'm just a member. I'm a professor of Spanish.
Professor of Spanish at Boston University. And his topic today is Satirical Poetry in Early Viceregal Peru, Literary and Cultural Contradictions, is really his specialty. Satire and poetry, these are the two topics that he's worked the most on, and in this period, like the 16th century in Peru. He's written several books on these topics. One titled Lima Satirizada, Mateo Rosas de Oquendo, and Juan del Val y Caviedes, and there's again several books on these related topics, and right now is working on a book titled Pirates and Prostitutes. So maybe he'll tell us a little bit about that too. That sounds interesting, right? So he's also a member of the Peruvian Academy of Language, and serving on the editorial board of a number of different reviews and publications. Has received several different fellowships, including the John Carter Brown Fellowship at the University of Michigan. So Professor Lasarte, welcome to Kennesaw. We'll turn the podium over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm dropping this. Thank you. Well, thank you very much for being here. It is indeed a pleasure for me and a great honor to have been invited to participate in this celebration, especially since you have a year dedicated to celebrating my home country, and that makes me very proud, and I'm very flattered for your invitation. The talk I had originally prepared went too long. It was going to be on epic poetry and satirical poetry, and it was when I was on page 65 I decided to stop. So I have concentrated solely on satire. And I was told that perhaps I should give you some introductory words on what I mean by Viceregal. The title of the presentation is Satirical Poetry in Early Viceregal Peru, Literary and Cultural Contradictions. Well, Viceregal just means the Viceroyalty of Peru. Or some people call it colonial Peru. Peru and Mexico were colonized way early in the 16th century. Lima was founded in the first decade of the 16th century. Mexico also. What makes it very different from the early colonies of, say, the United States, and this is a point of great interest, is that unlike the United States, the people who came either running away from looking for religious freedom, or were endangered slaves, but they were actually, the ideology behind it is that they were looking for a new place to found something different than Europe. Mexico, the Viceroyalty of Mexico, or what was called the Viceroyalty, of New Spain, that in itself tells you. And the Viceroyalty of Peru was initially called the Viceroyalty of New Castile. So the idea was that the Spanish conquistadores, or the Spanish explorers, come to the New World and create societies which emulate the courtly life of Spanish nobility or the Spanish king. The viceroy is like the king. The viceroy comes with a court, and he has noblemen, and very early on there are universities with doctorate degrees. They say that Lima in 1547 was a city that could compete with any European city in terms of its academic, social, and political structures. There were great jurists. There were great, in Mexico especially, the university had a great humanist component. By humanists, I mean people who were extremely well versed in classical Greek and classical Latin. So it's very different. Now, there used to be, of course, one always thinks of the first question that I was asked was, what happens to the indigenous population? The indigenous population is there, but it's voiceless for the most part. There are some early voices like Mamán Poma de Ayala, who writes a letter to the king saying, look, the Spaniards are really not doing us any good here. But they're not enslaved. They work, they continue. The idea was that there was the Aztecs or the Mexicans had an empire, and so did the Incas. So unlike, say, Chile, which was very difficult, or unlike the United States, where indigenous populations were nomads for the most part, except for the Pueblo Indians or some people like that, I don't want to say you killed them off, but you did a lot. And then you put them away in concentration camps, and now you give them some casinos, I think. I don't know. But I mean, I'm not being condescending, but in Peru there were great civilizations. The Inca civilization was an incredible civilization. It was an incredibly advanced agricultural civilization, with a king, with a nobility, with roads, with, Machu Picchu. It's become one of the 7 wonders of the world. Mexico was the same thing. When Cortés comes, he takes Tenochtitlan and builds the capital of Mexico on a great city. The description of Tenochtitlan is the same as the description of, say, a great European city. So that's a big difference. So what happens is that the Spaniards come to the New World and emulate and create a society which is very similar, like a European society. And I won't go into this, but ideologically the problem is that what is transferred is a feudal system that persists until recently. A feudal system in the sense that there are what were called encomendadores, who were the equivalent of noble people who had great expansions of land, and then they in turn would give some money to the viceroy, and the viceroy would accumulate some money and then give it to the king. So it was an imitation of a European feudal society, what took place in Mexico and in Peru. So that's sort of a broad context. Now, intellectual, the universities had great academies, or there were intellectual academies, people who got together, wrote contests, poetry contests, they wrote lyrical poetry, epic poetry. There are some great epic poems about the conquest of Chile. 2 of them I was going to speak about, La Araucana and Arauco Domado, but I had to leave that out. And I will focus on the writing of one very well-known poet, Juan del Valle y Caviedes, who wrote towards the latter part of the 17th century. Satire was being written already everywhere. As I say, there were academies. Academies were competitions. They would assign a topic. the king, the viceroy's foot. So everybody had to write satires about the viceroy's foot. You know, so there was really not necessarily a malice. It was an exercise in creativity. I know that there is negative satire, vituperation that can be very destructive, but it was lighthearted. And what is, it's, for example, you know, satire here, you know, The Daily Show, you know, after The Daily Show, my great hero, Colbert, the Colbert Nation. But of course, it's satire, it criticizes, it's informative, very informative, but it is not diatribe, it's not mean, it's not evil. There was evil satire. They were called pasquines that would be put on walls anonymously. These were not anonymous satires. I mean, everybody knew and everybody laughed. This was funny. But at the same time, the attitude towards literary creation was, especially in this period, which is called the Baroque period. And of course, you know the Baroque is complication. Gracian, who is one of the great exponents of Baroque theory, speaks of the metaphor as something being where the signifier and the signified should be very separate from each other to make the reader participate in the construction of the meaning. It's very much like when you read the very postmodern novels today that you don't understand, or you understand very little of what you're reading. The reader had to put a great effort in understanding and deciphering what was being written, not only in satirical poetry, but also in lyrical poetry and in epic poetry. These were very learned people who participated in these academies. And of course, the difficulty about reading, or what I have been doing with satire, is that satirical things and satirical slang dies out, as all slang does. When I say to my son, who's 12 years old, "That's really groovy," he says, "Papi." This is the 21st century. So one thing that always goes out of style is, because precisely slang is supposed to be, it was called la hermandad. It's something that, as you well know, goes out of style, and new words are always coming up, and new words are coming up, and the kids in the universities already know new words that we still don't know. And I'm learning from my son. I have my vocabulary. But now I will turn to this. So that's sort of an explanation. The poems that I have handed out, paraphrases, because the conceit, if you think of John Donne, for example, in British literature, John Donne is very difficult to read because his poetry is full of conceits, of occult meanings, or meanings that are multiple, are polysemic. So satire, as well as lyric poetry, the idea was to force the reader to exercise his ability in deciphering literature. Something which has not died. If you read some contemporary novels, contemporary quote-unquote postmodern novels, you really do have to struggle to understand them. Now, if you read a novel with, what's his name in the cover, the guy with the long blonde hair, Fabio. If you read a novel with Fabio on the cover, you know you're not going to have any problem reading it. But let me begin then. Although in the past I have studied several periods of Latin American literature and culture, I have concentrated mainly on the viceroyalties, and I already explained what the viceroyalty was, of Peru and Mexico, with a special interest in the 17th century. 17th century is my century. 17th century as well as the 20th the end of the 20th century. They're very, very similar in a way. The title of my lecture is a bit general, so I will try to synthesize what I intend to do. I will look at a very important poet and satirist of early Peru, the well-known Juan del Valle Caviedes, and by delving into some of his many poems that concern themselves with the tensions between a Creole population, and this is something I need to explain. The Creoles were the sons of Spaniards who were born in the New World. They were not indigenous. They had just were sons of Spaniards who lived in the New World and were born in the New World. So there were tensions between these Creoles and the peninsular population, or meaning the Spaniards who came directly from Spain. And tensions many times had to do with the fact that criollos were limited in the type of official positions that they could hold. In order, if you wanted to be an oidor de la corte, for example, they would bring a Spaniard. But a criollo was just as well educated and capable of doing this, but the idea was to not, the fear always behind this was that the criollos, I'm sorry, the criollos were, at least it's Vivaldi. And the criollos, the Spaniards were always afraid the criollos would gain financial, political power. Just like in feudal societies, the king was also afraid that the noblemen would gain sufficient power and perhaps take over or create their own mini kingdoms. And they had their own armies. So the situation is similar. So there were always these tensions between the Creoles and the Spaniards. And not to say by any means that the Creole thought he was a Peruvian. No, he was a Spaniard. There was no such thing as a Peruvian yet. That doesn't come into being until the 19th century. What I intend to do is highlight not only their political and economic struggles, but also show how in Valle's poetry, the tensions and struggles between peninsulars and Creoles are already planting the seeds of what could be seen as a sense of an American or different subjectivity from that of the colonizing Spaniard. Just the seeds. There is something different. Juan del Valle Caviedes was a prolific writer who not only wrote satire but also religious and philosophical poems. Although he's well known for his satire of the medical profession, a very conventional topic, literary topic, all satirists from Juvenal on wrote about doctors. He also satirized many other types, and of course, women. I plan here to look at three poems not only as mere aesthetic imitation or literary imitation, witty imitation of a long tradition of satirical burlesque discourse, but also to look at them as cultural discourse that addresses questions of 17th century Peruvian subjectivity. This essay, I think, could be called a 17th century anatomy of Peruvian society for several reasons. One, because I tend to think of satire, at least Valle's satire, as an anatomical process in which the social body and many of its individual bodies are scrutinized in a serio-comical way. Second, because I think the writer himself thought of his work as anatomical, as we shall see. Finally, I should explain that one of the most interesting aspects of Valle's poetry is his skill at wordplay. Something that makes lecturing in English very difficult. I have handed out the Spanish quotes I will be referring to, followed by my very poor paraphrases, which try to explain some of the semantic complexities of the poems. Valle Caviedes was born in Jaén, Spain in 1645 and traveled to the New World as a young man, settling in Lima, where besides becoming a prolific writer, engages in various commercial activities, among them trading, shopkeeping, and mining. The scant archival information available shows that throughout his life, the poet had some contact with the centers of viceregal power. He married Beatriz de Godoy, daughter of Don Antonio de Godoy Ponce de León, a man of rich and noble status. And among his relatives, we find two judges of the High Court of Lima, Don Berjón de Caviedes and Dr. Juan González de Santiago. Both belonged to the highest spheres of viceregal government. There's also documentation that shows that Valle Caviedes entered into a business agreement or arrangement with General Juan Bautista de la Rigada Llanero, an important member of the court of the Count of Moncloa. In spite of his relationship with the court, however, his attempts at business and mining activities ended in economic hardship, and his last will and testament shows he had very little, if anything, to bequeath to his survivors. This viceregal poet, Juan del Valle Caviedes, is sometimes known as the Quevedo of the colonies due to his great affinity to the Spanish early 17th century Baroque satirists. Very famous person, Quevedo. But Quevedo had written some 45 years earlier. Valle, as Quevedo, makes use of a long tradition of well-known satirical conventions of Western culture. This is imitation of long-standing topoi or conventions that they just repeat. But when they repeat them adding something of their own. What is called, what Leo Spitzer calls, when through the process of imitatio or imitation, because 17th century poets, unlike romantic poets write from the heart. 17th century poets imitate Petrarch. But of course, they contribute something of their own, which Leo Spitzer called, not Leo Spitzer, but Ernst Curtius calls outdoing. There's also a sense, there's always a desire to outdo the poet you're imitating. And I think the same thing happens with Valle Caviedes. His poems, for example, denounce hypocrisy and braggery in courtly life, and also offer his readers a comical and grotesque parade of conventional types, such as, among other, lecherous old codgers, lascivious women, adulterers, cuckolds, seducers, false virgins, prostitutes, lawyers, notaries, scribes, and university professors. In all cases, tied to a satire of the medical profession, his favorite and obsessive target. As we shall see, however, one interesting aspect of his works, and worthy of study, is that such traditional and cliched themes and characters, although imitating with outstanding wit, are recontextualized. This is important. They're the same topics, but they're recontextualized in discursive practices that contain a historical supplement that furthers our understanding of the social and cultural complexities of 17th century Peru. Critical readings of the poetry of Valle Caviedes have had three main orientations. There are studies of a philological nature that judge the aesthetic value of his works by comparing them with his peninsular counterparts, his Spanish counterparts. Spaniards often relegating him to an inferior status. Peruvian, on the other hand, many times exalting his superiority. Other critics, given the rich referential value of satire, have preferred to focus on his works as sources for documenting historical events and social practices, bypassing the literary and creative aspects of his poetry. Finally, some of the more recent approaches to Valle Caviedes of a cultural nature have paid attention to how his works address the ideological contradictions of his 17th century Peruvian colonial society. As I already suggested, my study belongs to this latter approach. Valle's satirical texts, with the exception of very few poems that were published in the proceedings of courtly contests, have come to us in manuscript form, so far in 10 manuscripts of varying lengths and at times of dubious attributions. One interesting fact is that all his manuscripts seem to show the poet attempting to give his multiple and fragmented works, although periodically, a certain order or organization associated with the supposedly permanence of the published book. Because these are manuscripts. All extant manuscript collections begin with a parody of the well-known preliminaries that introduce the publication of a tome or a book. It is my belief that such mock preliminaries entail a critical perspective on the letter or archival document which played a very important part in Spain's attempt at maintaining its colonies in order. But that's material for a different talk. In those introductory pages of the manuscript, we find the typical preliminaries of a book, among them dedications, official approvals, licenses to publish, expert opinions, and a prologue. In the dedication to an allegorical death, we read that the satirical persona, or the satirical narrator, if you want to call him that, who claims to have barely escaped from the deadly deeds of doctors, wishes to be a puntual coronista, or an exact and factual chronicler of their wrongdoings. And that for this purpose he has written a cuerpo de libro, or a body of a book. The commonplace identification between body and book is repeated in the parecer, or the opinion, of the preliminaries supposedly written by the anatomy. The anatomy was a skeleton of the Hospital of San Andres in Lima, a skeleton who finds the book worthy of publication, since, like him, he says, can serve as an example for mortals. This statement, coming from a skeleton, recalls a favored counter-reformist image for vanitas, the skull that served as a reminder of the brevity of life. One of the great preoccupations of the Baroque thinker. Simultaneously, however, the word parecer, besides meaning opinion, also means likeness. In other words, the skeleton or anatomy is also a metaphor for the book. It is like the book. And the word anatomy, besides skeleton, was also a general term for close analysis. And by the 17th century, it was already being used to refer to, quote, the dissection or artificial separation of the various parts of the body so that the functions of each be known and illnesses be cured effectively. This is very early. Furthermore, on these preliminaries, there is also an identification between medical practice and satire as cure of social ills. In its mock prologue, the satirical persona states, and I paraphrase the verses, "My treatise is a better doctor, because if you look at it closely, it causes merriment, which is an excellent cure." End of quote. The interconnection between satirist as chronicler and doctor of social ills seems to be directly tied to his perception of satire as anatomical speculum, as a mirror. Lima's social body is represented, cut up, and scrutinized throughout the work's heterogeneous reference. Finally, one more note of interest, giving the serio-comical gist of Valle's satire, it is noteworthy that during the author's times, this is a footnote, according to Giovanni Ferrari, so-called anatomical theaters for academic learning often turned into public spectacles not exempt from Carnegalesque laughter and erotic voyeurism interest, a practice that is quite pertinent for understanding of Vallecavides's satirical anatomy of Lima, presented quite baroquely so as a theater of grotesque bodies and human foibles. The anatomical knife or pen of the satirist examines closely a myriad of social practices that informed life in 17th century Lima. Unlike the official chroniclers of the time, by the crown, which idealized viceregal life and society for the pleasure of colonial ideology, Valles' knowledge of Lima is that of the anatomist who delves deeply into the social body, bringing forth its uncensored and raw practices. Well, so much for another mini introduction about Valle. Now I will attempt a dissection of my own by looking at 3 examples or poems that, from my point of view, focus on some of the emergent, conflictive, and ambivalent Peruvian subjectivities of the 17th century. First, I will take a look at what could be thought of as one of the earliest literary manifestations of misogynist discourse in Peru. And we all know what misogyny is. It's As I mentioned, Valle Caviedes' favorite satirical target was the medical profession, but also with no less insistence, his satire was also directed at women. It is interesting to notice, however, that if much has been written on his attack of doctors, almost nothing of substance has been said about his vituperation of women. I am not sure why this is the case, but I would like to offer some conjectures on his misogynist writings. Autobiographical readings, which, by the way, have been the norm, something which I elude altogether, have insinuated that the poet's attack on women respond to his unlucky, or perhaps his lucky, fortune with romantic involvements. What has been commonly said, however, is that his misogyny conforms to the imitation of a long-standing tradition of Western literature. This is undoubtedly true. Valle's satire, as most satire of the period, imitates a tradition. But I wonder if this explanation is solely appropriate. Should we accept it as sufficient and satisfactory? One should perhaps recall some much-quoted words by Howard Block, for whom to see misogyny only under the lens of tradition is a way of naturalizing or universalizing anti-feminist thought, and as such, although perhaps unknowingly, perpetuate Western misogyny. My intent here, although partially so, is to look at how the misogynist tradition that Valle Caviedes imitates is at the same time informed by a historical supplement that deals with its American context. In other words, to read his anti-feminist works not only an aesthetic and burlesque imitation of, say, European misogyny, but also as a cultural discourse. Perhaps one could think of historicizing or contextualizing in the New World Western misogynist traditions, and as such contribute to a recognition of his accidental and not essential nature. Throughout his works, Valle Caviedes reiterates the already mentioned association between satirical and medical practices. With his scalpel, he wishes to uncover and remove a variety of social and moral illnesses, such as courtly hypocrisy, envy, avarice, etc., but also diseases linked to erotic entanglements among the well-known ereos. I don't know if you know the term ereos. Ereos comes from Ovid. It's love sickness. We all must have suffered from ereos from time to time. Where you can't sleep, where you can't eat. Ereos or love sickness, a grave illness for which, since antiquity, a common cure was a most misogynist vituperation of women. How many times have you heard, think of her doing this, or think of her doing that, and you'll forget her? I mean, this goes back to Ovid in De Amore, on his book on De Amore. And his remedies for love, Ovid's remedies for love, give you all the possibilities of how to get rid of the memories of the woman who left you for someone else. So a common cure was precisely a most misogynist vituperation of women. Thinking of her negatively, saying things about her negatively, speaking of her negatively, and so forth. What I would like to do, however, is to expand a bit the historical horizon of this traditional cure for ereos, in order to incorporate into the discussion a new illness linked to women, which could not have been part of the, say, Ovidian or Archpriest of Talavera's misogynist curative prescriptions. I'm referring to syphilis, or the pox, the mal de bubas, as it was called at the time, a disease which first is mentioned in Europe in 1494. Already in 1495, Francisco López de Villalobos, in his Sumario de la Medicina sobre un tratado sobre las pestíferas bubas, or Summary of Medicine with a treatise on the pestiferous pox, identifies a plague-like component to the negative effects of love sickness. Among his warnings, he states, ereos, according to our authors, responds to a corrupt imagination and makes men complain of pains of love. And advises that the patient's friends, quote, remove him quickly from that lady as men run from tainted air in times of pestilence, end of quote. A direct link to syphilis is not mentioned here, but the erotic is seen in terms of a plague. It should also be noted that syphilis became a most favored disease of the 17th century poetic imagination, given the Baroque's preference for the grotesque and the decaying bodies. There are countless examples of the physical lesions of the so-called pox in ascetic and moralistic writers, as well as in satirists, among them the Peruvian Valle Caviedes. What I would like to suggest now is that, giving the express medical purpose of his satirical works, Valle's obsessive and simultaneously comical and monstrous descriptions of the possible effects of carnal love, although resounding of moral preaching, at the same time, in the face of the presence of syphilis, can be read as examples to intimidate would-be lovers. An important fact that corroborates the relationship I want to establish between Valle's description of the effects of syphilis in misogynist discourse is that in his complete works, this illness is only described for the case of women. The female body is, in a sense, the page upon which the physical dangers of sexual love are written. Let us turn there into one poem whose title is A una dama que por serlo paró en la caridad. To a dama, dame, dama, lady, who, because she was so, ended up in charities. See, this is what's difficult to translate. The title is comically polysemous, or has several meanings. Dama, or lady, besides its official meaning, in slang also connoted prostitute or concubine. The lady ends up in charities, but charities in an alternate reading refers to the Hospital of Charities in Lima, where the lady ends up. The poem makes use of a number of well-trodden satirical conventions on promiscuity, with quite of an ingenious and original use of conceits, wordplays. In two of his many stanzas in which the effects of the pox are described, the poem focuses on the eyes and the mouth of the lady. The mouth being of great importance for the pleasures of sexual encounters, and one of Valle's favorite satirical female targets. In his works, women are vociferous, demanding, gluttons, gossips, etc. All vices or behaviors related to the mouth. In this poem, we read that the stricken lady, already in hospital, and this is your quote one, I'll read it in Spanish and then read my paraphrase. De su estrella se lamenta porque en luceros peligras y cuanto causó la Venus con el mercurio no quitan. My paraphrase is, she laments her unlucky star because her bright stars are in danger, if all which had caused by Venus, Mercury does not take back. Not easy to understand. The semantic playfulness of these verses conjoins echoes of the much-used celestial metaphors for the description of women, with certain references to her sexuality. That the woman laments her unlucky star has several connotations that should be looked at. On the one hand, it is an obvious reference to her bad luck in terms of the well-known relationship between destiny and astrology. But her complaint also alludes to an accepted belief, well documented, for example, in the already mentioned Francisco López de Villalobos, that contagion of venereal disease, as most plagues, was also linked to astrology. And I have a footnote on this if you want to discuss it later. It's very, very interesting. On the other hand, the star of which she complains is also a direct reference to a syphilitic ulcer, a common metaphorical use that we find, for example, in La Lozana Andaluza of Francisco de Ricado, a work written around the same time. Furthermore, the star, or ulcer, brings to mind, in a parodic fashion, the infected eye of the woman. Stars, or heavenly bodies, were commonly used as metaphors to praise the beauty of a woman's eye, a woman's eyes. Your eyes are like stars. If we look back at the first same verse, we read that the lady laments her unlucky star. According to the Diccionario de Autoridades, which is the first dictionary of the Spanish language of 1726, to lament, it says, brought about tears and sobs. We all know that. But it's a connotation that leads us to visualize an image of grotesque conceit. The laments tear is seen as the draining of infected matter, since the lady's eye has been compromised by the pox, a not uncommon effect of the disease. The semantic layers surrounding the lady's eye are unfolded further in the following verses, since we read that she, her bright stars, or metaphorically her eyes, are in danger. The poem foresees then a possible physical blindness, but at the same time a moral one due to her promiscuous behavior. The poem's next stanza advances further its grotesque portrait of the syphilitic woman. And here's a second quote. We are told wittily, but repulsively, that the lady, como gusanos de seda, babas por la boca hila, que en el andar con los capullos no ha olvidado todavía. My paraphrase, as if silkworms, her saliva she weaves in her mouth, since being with cocoons is still in her mind. I won't stop in details, suffice it to notice the grotesque and quite suggestive metaphoric construction that intertwines the worms of death with the desire for renewal on the part of the lady. The saliva that she weaves in her mouth is seen as silkworms, a mouth, however, that in spite of its illness, continues dreaming of desiring to be with cocoons, an image which is charged with connotations of oral sex. The lady's mouth, therefore, remains as a possible vehicle for contagion and spread of the pox. Unfortunately, given the time limitations and perhaps some prudence, I cannot look closer at Valle's witty sexual conceits. One can conjecture, however, that such gross descriptions, albeit comically at times, should serve as warnings for would-be lovers. I should now, however, as promised, examine this poem's negative descriptions of the female body in the context of Peru's viceregal ideology. In the poem, there are many references to one of the two most common cures for venereal disease. This is true. That of the application of mercury or quicksilver. Such references to this cure intersect with certain reflection on Peru's mineral wealth. Concerning the lady's treatment at the charity hospital, we now read, and I will quote, "A puro azogue presume la tienen de volver piña, de andar en azogue en ella tiene la culpa su mina, la cual tiene más estacas que todas las de las Indias." My paraphrase, by the use of quicksilver, she expects to go back to being like a pineapple. That she's full of quicksilver in her mind's fault, a mind which has more stakes than all of the Indies. Difficult paraphrase. The quicksilver, silver was precisely one of the most common cures for syphilis. Actually, it worked against it, but the quicksilver, conjectures the lady, could make her new again, cure her, and turn her into a fresh fruit, a pineapple, a fruit undoubtedly very appetizing, but as we should recall, dangerously covered by thorns. Furthermore, the pineapple that she desires to be also reminds us visually of the effects of the pox on her face. More importantly, however, it is a fruit clearly and repeatedly associated with New World nature. A fruit which, as some may recall, was given its name and praised in detail, even drawn by the 16th century official historian of the Crown of Spain, Gonzalo Fernández de Oviedo. But this word piña, or pineapple, in the vocabulary of miners, was also, you see, here you have another further meaning, was also in the vocabulary of miners, the word pineapple was also used to refer to the precious silver recovered after the raw material was purified by the use of mercury or quicksilver. There is therefore a comical wink directed at the lady's purity, but with a semantic link between her sexuality and American nature. An important link which is repeated in the following verse, where we read that the lady in her mind, M-I-N-E, connotes in her mind she had more stakes than those of all the Indies. Here, to have many stakes in her mine, M-I-N-E, connotes promiscuous sexual activity and simultaneously refers to the marks left on her face by the pox. But it should be added that the word stake was also used to mark the spot to signal the presence of a mine. An abundance of stakes therefore denoted the mineral wealth of the New World. On the body of the lady, therefore, we see written or inscribed New World riches and diseases. We now begin to visualize a sort of burlesque analogy between venereal disease with all its misogynist connotations and the abundance of mineral veins of Peru. It is not surprising that such a relationship is developed in greater detail in the following verses. And here's quote 4, where we read that for the lady, the pox, and I quote, venganza es de las estafas, si a sus amantes decía, el almadén cuyo azogue devengó Huancavelica. My paraphrase is a revenge for her cheating, since to her lovers she would say, give your souls, el almadén. It's a difficult pun here to translate, whose quicksilver production was outdone by that of Huancavelica. Huancavelica was a mining site in Peru, a great silver mine. And I will return to the world almadén. In this stanza there is a comical and polysemous reference, but quite direct, to the mercury or quicksilver extracted from the Peruvian mines of Huancavelica. The lady is guilty of cheating her lovers by saying to them, el almadén, alma being soul, in other words, and then a conjugation of the verb dar, to give. That is, almadén, which is actually, as we shall see, a place in Spain, is read as to give up one's soul. In other words, a common Spaniard expression for spend every penny you have. But to give up one's soul could also connote a moral degradation by way of sexual activities, or even death as a result of venereal contagion. These are some of the word plays with almadén, a conceit that makes implicit reference to a commonly held moral criticism of the time that associated America's mineral wealth with greed. In other words, the exploitation of America's natural body and its rich mines of Huancavelica, which the poem states, making use of a further meaning of almadén, outdid the well-known and very productive mines of Spain of almadén. However, further implicit meanings become visible when we recall, as Guillermo Loman Villena has shown, that the mines at Huancavelica were, the Peruvian mines, were scandalous in their countless financial irregularities and clandestine commercial activities. In other words, commercial cheating, which recalls the tricks of the ladies' trade. The poem then seems to make references to a number of popularized ideas on the negative effect of American riches, moralizing ideas which we find, for example, in authors like Góngora and Quevedo, two famous Spanish poets. In Valle's poems, sexual promiscuity and greed interconnect two cultural references tied to the New World: its metals and its women, both with negative connotations. What I would like to suggest is that Valle's poem is conscious of and perhaps satirizes certain commonplace denigrating beliefs about the New World. Among them, that the lady's venereal disease, her ill-fated destiny, is directly tied to her New World subjectivity. In the stanza which spoke of the quicksilver of Huancavelica, we also read that the lady, and I'll quote, this is quote 5, tiene un mal francés, tan hijo de estas provincias que nacido en la ciudad que llaman de picardía. Has a French disease. You know, syphilis was called the Italian disease, the French disease, the Spanish disease, and all kinds of it has a French disease, a disease offspring of these provinces, born in the city they called Picardia, or mischief. Picardie in France. But he's talking of Lima, a disease which was born in Lima. These verses allude to a well-known debate concerning the origin of syphilis. Was it brought to the New World by Europeans, or was it transported to the Old World by Columbus's sailors? Curiously, it is the same official royal historian Fernández de Oviedo, already cited, who was one of the first to locate the origin of the diseases in the American continent. By the second half of the 17th century, when Valle Caviedes writes his poem, the idea that in American there was a predisposition towards the pox had been had become commonplace knowledge. In 1612, for example, the Dominican Juan de la Puente repeated a scientific belief which had much circulation, a belief which, it should be noted, reminds us of the lady's unlucky star. Juan de la Puente informs us that Americans' constellations induce inconstancy, lasciviousness, and lies, vices typical of the native population, and that through the influence of local astral constellations turn into characteristics that befall the Spaniards who are born and reside in America. Valles' poem therefore implicitly recalls this often cited belief of astral influence, the already mentioned American constellations, on the fate of the Spaniards in the New World. We could perhaps say that the poem connotes that the lady's star, her ill fortune of falling sick with a pox, stems in part to her contact with American soil, a place in which it was believed the pox had had its beginnings. I should now bring together some of the conjectures presented so far about this poem. We have seen that Valle Caviedes imagined his satire as a form of medical practice. And I have also suggested, in order to warn against the so-called plague of the pox, he makes use of this disgusting description of the female's infected body. At the same time, however, such conventional grotesque descriptions of the female, as found in a myriad of Baroque authors such as Quevedo himself, are contextualized satirically within an ideology that informed the European imaginary of the times. That is, he inscribes in his poem familiar denigrations of the New World and its inhabitants. Significantly, the poem gives us a reference to the birth of syphilis in a paradoxical fashion, speaking as the French disease, but at the same time saying it was the offspring of the local provinces and born in the city of Picardia, roguishness, and known epithet for Lima. This paradoxical or contradictory reference to the pox is a commentary, I believe, on the conflicted nature of American subjectivity, torn between the old and the new. The pox is called the French disease, but it is born in Lima. Beliefs concerning the New World as a place given to licentious sexual activity and economic promiscuity recontextualize a long-standing misogynist tradition within the creation of a nascent image of American nature as origin of all of its later misfortunes. One would only have to recall cultural inventions of women, later women, such as La Malinche or Doña Bárbara, who exemplify an American negativity that had served until recent times to explain many of Latin Americans' social problems. Valle Caviedes partakes of a misogynist tradition, but his scrutiny of viceregal society gives us a different perspective through which the reader can uncover the anxieties of a Spanish society who, towards the end of the 17th century, was beginning to come to terms with its complex and problematic relationship with the so-called mother country. When one reads Valle's poetry, not only as witty aesthetic imitation of his Spanish counterparts, but as cultural discourse, the suffering and infected ladies of his poetry allow us to visualize some of the many fissures and social contradictions that were taking place in New World viceroyalties. The ladies undoubtedly perpetuate the lamentable misogynist tradition of Spanish literature, but at the same time they offer the poet the opportunity to recognize or perhaps question some of the early inventions that informed the European view of the New World toward the end of the 17th century, something which at the same time allows us to recognize or underscore the historical and not the natural condition of the vituperation of women in Western culture. I should now add that I'm not claiming that Valle Caviedes' satire offers as a subversive stance against misogyny of Spanish rule. No. The poet is a Spaniard who lived in the New World, and in the role of a local satirical anatomist, looks careful and reflects on some of the early differences and contradictions of Lima's social and political body. I hope I'm not running out of time.
15.
Because I have 275 pages. I will now turn to another set of poems, which have also been seen merely as witty imitation of the stock of Western satire. Again, however, if we read them in the context, this is easier. In the content of viceregal ideology, one is able to detect further meditations on New World realities and its colonial subjects. In one of his set of poems that, I might just skip this. You know, and go to the third part, because it's going to be too long. Right, good. So, because there are three poems, I'm going to skip the second one and go to the third one. Much like the case of his contemporaries on the other side of the ocean, Valle-Cavides' Baroque worldview shows a preoccupation with... José Antonio Maravall is a great historian who wrote about the Baroque in Spain. The book is called El Barroco, the Baroque. He speaks of the Baroque, and he speaks of a principle called modificación, or mudanza, mutability, instability, changing. In the case of the Viceregal context, such sensitivities to change must have been intensified by the formation of what could be thought of a new society, and by the initial rise of proto-national feelings, which Bernard Lavalle refers to as proto-criollismo. As José Durán reminds us, unlike Spanish Peninsular society, social mobility, commerce among the nobility was not looked down upon, but rather accepted, much unlike Spain. The New World resident was aware that not only his surrounding, but his or her subjectivity differed in some fashion from those of the homeland. It is therefore no surprise that myths of transformation are part of Valle-Cavides' literary repertoire. A favorite one seems to be the Narcissus myth. We know the Narcissus myth. He retells it in a mock mythological poem, of which there are many examples in European literatures, but very few in Spanish America. Diverging from the direct Ovidian tradition to which it belongs, and in the vein of Spanish, I don't know if you've read Ovid's myth of Narcissus, but the French and the Spanish, they read Ovid, but there were moralized versions or moralized translations of Ovid, because Ovid could be pretty risque. Diverging from the direct Ovidian tradition to which it belongs, and in the vein of Spanish translations and their moral commentaries, such as the one by Juan Pérez de Moya of 1585, Valle-Cavides' Narcissus, upon looking at his reflection in the water, does not see himself. Rather, he sees a nymph. And it is with her that he falls madly in love. The poem's narrator, in a burlesque spirit, tells us that Narcissus, in love with that image which is and is not his, repeatedly attempts to return to it, but when he looks in the water's mirror, he sees only a distorted replica of himself. In other words, he sees what he is and what he is not. For example, here's a quote. I'll just give you the paraphrase. In ponds and wells, he looked for a watered-down nymph, but pleasure remained in the well, where she was never to be found. To catch her, he would plunge his hands into the watery crystal, but he could never fish her out. We notice that Narcissus' wishes are frustrated because he cannot find himself, or to recall the Ovidian text, he cannot know himself. This is a problem with a twofold interest, because if on the one hand it makes reference to the ontological uncertainty of the character, as we shall see, the poem also addresses problems of pictorial representation and its relation to poetry. It takes up the well-known Horatian concept of ut pictura poesis, a concept which was the object of much discussion in Valle-Cavides' time. So let us look at this other side of the poem. We read, and I will skip the Spanish. The nymph's beauty I cannot copy, for all I have are shadows, and I lack colors. Moreover, this painting comes from a press, and when Narcissus looks at himself, his impression appears in white ink. Leaving aside some of the sexual connotations of the poem, the white ink, I won't go into that, especially if we were to read it in its totality from these last verses, it is worthwhile to point out several things. First, Valle-Cavides' reference to the difficulty of pictorial representation seems to carry a perhaps mockingly critical view of the polemic taking place between theoreticians and painters that of giving preference to the drawing or to favor lively colors. In the poem, we witness a complaint that in order to make a copy of the nymph, the poet only has sombras, shadows, a term which is at the center of the discussion by painters. It should also be added that the word shadow contains allusions to the identity of the subject. In the same dictionary of autoridades, we read that the word sombra or shadow meant specter, ghost, and, quote, appearance or likeness of something. The satirical persona's complaint that he only has shadows and is lacking in color seems to be linked to the representation of the self or subjectivity, this, as mentioned, mainly through a critical stance on pictorial representation. Maraval, the historian, quoting Saavedra Fajardo, affirms that the Baroque favored colors because they were what, I quote, give their ultimate spirit of being to things, and is also that which best uncovers the movements of the soul, end of quote. And equally, in relation to Titian's innovative attempt at almost careless smudges, he adds in that its 17th century, quote, it is judged that only this sort of painting gives an authentic representation of life. It is a painting of the unfinished, variable, movable, unstable, fit to capture man on life, or life. Such approach is understood since man is in possession not of a complete being, but rather a being in the process of becoming, a fieri, not a factum. Therefore, correspondingly, an unfinished being and in a continuous state of change. Such a perception of painting as it relates to potential mobility is important to Maraval's view of the Baroque, for it is seen in its social and economic terms as one more example of the ideology that moves the Spanish state in the direction of fomenting cultural expressions and political institutions of a disciplinary nature, and therefore promote a reaction toward a static society. It is my sense that a facile transfer of Maraval's concept to the New World is a common error taken by most colonialists who tend to think that Spanish 17th century economic and therefore social crises were being duplicated in the New World provinces. There's much documentation to the contrary, but again, that's an interesting subject for another lecture. To go back to the Narcissus poem, what we observe then is that in it there is an interesting preoccupation, quite baroquely so, with a precarious and confusing borderline between self and the appearance or representation of self. Furthermore, the cited verses, the satirical persona juxtaposes his perspective with that of Narcissus. I quote again. Moreover, this painting comes from a press, and when Narcissus looks at himself, his impression appears in white ink. These verses take us now in a different direction, although a parallel direction, on the difficulties of artistic representation. The reference here seems to be that of the impression of figures on paper, or xylography, again putting into question the uncertain relationship between the self and its representation, with perhaps a degrading or further unstabling element of self associated to the multiple reproductive capacity of printed reproductions. More important, however, is the fact that in these verses, the impression that Narcissus has of himself, impression as a word not only refers to the visual but also to a moral self-understanding, attends to a greater dismantling of the figure. He is no longer represented by mere shadows, but now through white ink. In other words, he is now a colorless and translucent Narcissus. My interpretation leads one to conjecture that metatextual reflections on the problematic representation of Narcissus and his frustrated desire for self-knowledge conform to Baroque preoccupations as expressed by Maraval, that is, of a self who finds himself in a situation of instability or ontological uncertainty. What needs to be added, however, is that such reading of the poem as Baroque expression must be enhanced by looking at the text as cultural or colonial discourse, as a poem written by a resident of Peru's Viceregal society. Let us push then the reading of this Baroque poem into its proper colonial setting. I'm almost done. It would be quite simplistic and erroneous, although perhaps approved by many of my colonialist peers, to say that the poem and its parody of the Ovidian tradition already expresses a subversive stance against canonical European thought. Such interpretation of a post-colonial venue of which there are many cases, would give Galle Cavides an anti-European or separatist sentiment, a sentiment that he obviously did not have, and it would not rise in the New World until centuries later. What is important, however, is to recognize that Valle is born in Spain, but arrives in the New World at an early age and remains in Peru for the rest of his life. He is witness and participant of many social and political tensions of viceregal life, and these undoubtedly informed his poetic imagination. It is a well-known fact, although at times exaggerated, that these were antagonisms between criollos, those born, as I said, in the New World or permanent residents, and peninsulars or Spaniards who either came to the New World as part of the Viceroy's court or were here to gather riches and return to Spain. These groups, not to mention others of various racial compositions such as castas, were always in a process of creating and dissolving alliances and antagonisms. The Mexican poet Octavio Paz, although speaking for the case of the Viceroyalty of New Spain or Mexico, says that many of New World inhabitants felt themselves to be loyal subjects of the crown, but at the same time could not hide from themselves their inferior status. Spanish bureaucracy disdained them. The criollo was and was not Spanish. In the 17th century, these contradictory feelings, says Octavio Paz, did not express themselves in political terms. Rather, they, and I would add, much like here for Valle Cavides, they had an effective and artistic coloring. I think it would not be too daring to conjecture that the complex and contradictory psychological makeup of certain colonial sectors, such as the criollo, a type of pilgrim at home who felt he was and was not a Spaniard, informs Valle's creation of a chiaroscuro, but also colorless and translucent narcissus. Curiously, it is interesting to note that in 1610, dark colors were linked to the bastard. That's in the dictionary of Covarrubias. Covarrubias, in its lexicon, informs us that this word, that of bastard, refers to that which was made in the dark. But the reading of the poem in its colonial context should go further. Let us recall that the poem's references to Narcissus' portrait vacillate between shadows and white ink. That is, I believe, more than just a self-reflexive moment on the pictorial representation of his subject or a mere parody of the Ovidian myth. I conjecture that the poem points to one more instance in which Western literary tradition enters into a cultural dialogue with New World realities, especially as it concerns the already mentioned conflictive relationship between peninsular Spaniards and Creoles. The already cited historian Bernard Lavalle, although I think I skipped him, among others, reminds us that the critical attacks on the American continent express the conviction that the New World would have an inevitable negative effect on its inhabitants, to the point that, I quote, on repeated occasions, even at the end of the 17th century, eminent Spanish specialists were directly asking themselves if, with the passing of time, under the effect of American nature intertwined with particular local life conditions and specific astrological influences, Creoles would not end up being similar in all aspects to the Indians. Furthermore, to this last historical worry, I should add some words by Juan López de Velasco, who in his Geography and Universal Description of the Indies from the year 1571 to 1574 says, quote, Spaniards who moved to those parts, meaning America, and reside in them for a long time due to the change in the heavens and the climate of those regions have some changes in color and human qualities. But the ones who are born there, the ones called Creoles, although thought of in all respects as Spaniards, are actually in effect already changed in color and physical appearance. Now we should recall that Narcissus' conflicted self-reflection, on the other hand, ends up in absence. Both, on the other hand, also an preoccupation with color, if this color be white or dark. Given the belief that Creoles could transform themselves in all respects into Indians, including a change of color, and given the many anxious references to the castas or dark populations of Peru through Valle's satire, we should perhaps now rethink the poem in terms of an American Narcissus of the 17th century. Narcissus, comically yet seriously conscious of all the social and political implications directly related to caste and skin color. Finally, I should perhaps also reflect on the fact that Valles' Narcissus sees itself as a nymph, a female Narcissus. As we have seen, a proper awareness of literary tradition, in other words, and knowledge of Pérez de Moya's translation of Ovid does not really allow us to ponder on issues of gender or sexual orientation. Pérez de Moya's Ovid eludes self-love. That's why when Narcissus looks at himself, he sees a woman. This is he himself, because he doesn't want to think of self-love. It's a sin. Perhaps for moral reasons, perhaps for its sexual connotations, or for both. The sensual language found in Ovid's description of the young boy Narcissus is replaced by Pérez de Moya, who obviously was used by Viceregal, with the following phrase, albeit not example from certain ambiguity. Quote, Narcissus, believing himself to be a nymph from the same fountain, fell madly in love with her. Clearly this statement deserves scrutiny, but I'm really running out of time. For now, I would only like to suggest that the transvestite element found in Pérez de Moya's transformation of Ovid, when borrowed at Viceregal, generates one further echo concerning the ontological ambiguity or uncertainty of nascent New World subjectivities. To recall Octavio Paz's words, a Spaniard who is and who is not a Spaniard. To conclude, my approach to early Spanish-American selves in Viceregal's Anatomy of Lima's social body, from a modern perspective, questions the idea of an essentialized self, a preoccupation much in vogue these days. But we should not forget that in the 17th century, as Viceregal reminds us, the concept of mudanza, or modification, became so acute and so decisive in the organization of the Baroque worldview that it came to inspire a transitoriness whereby the principle of identity tottered, and along with it, the very notion of being. This is a counter-reformist idea with many points of contact with our own modern or postmodern understanding of the self, although they shouldn't be equated. Viceregal's satire, that of an American Spaniard of the 17th century, is informed by the Baroque worldview, an optimal view with which to reflect upon the conflictive nascent New World subjectivities, as exemplified in the case by conventional satirical burlesque types, such as the prostitute infected by the pox, the poor poet whom I skipped, or the figure of Narcissus. Thank you very much.